much more than 10. Ain't no psychiatrist, ain't no doctor with the degree.
Well, tributes have been flowing in all day, remembering Aretha Franklin, who died today at the age of 76. She started out as a child singing gospel, and the rest is history. 42 studio albums, winner of 18 Grammy Awards, the first woman inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987. Tim Roxborogh from the Weekend Collective has been a fan for a long time. Tim, evening to you.
Evening, Larry.
Your standout memory of Aretha Franklin?
For me, it's that a lot of people didn't realise she could write songs too, but the way she could interpret other people's songs is probably the most standout thing about her. But if there's one memory, it was actually just 2.5 years ago at the Kennedy Center Honors, which were honouring Carole King, and Aretha Franklin came out on stage to sing Natural Woman, and she was wearing a fur coat, which is not the done thing, but you're Aretha Franklin, so you can do whatever you want, and she's carrying a clutch purse. And you just think, why are you taking your purse out on stage to sing? But again, she's Aretha Franklin, and she just casually plops her clutch purse down on the grand piano and starts playing Natural Woman, and which Carole King wrote, and Carole's jaw drops. By the end of the performance, Obama, who was there, was in tears. But you're reminded that here was a lady who could interpret songs and make them so much her own, which is a cliche but true. She was a brilliant pianist. And even in her 70s, just a couple of years before she died, she was still an insane vocalist. And that probably, for me, is the standout memory.
How do you think she managed to stay relevant for so many decades?
I think she knew that she was the queen of soul. She knew that she was the best. So even when her commercial fortunes went down a little bit. So remembering with Aretha that from the age of about 9 or 10, she was told that she was going to be a superstar. But the fame didn't come straight away. Her first album came out in 1956. She didn't start having really big hits until 1967. So she felt that she'd earned it and that her rightful place was at the top. Like, people will say that she was humble. Maybe on the one hand she was, but she knew how good she was too. So by 1972, her hits became a little more sporadic. But I think her sense that her rightful place was at the top meant that she never gave up. And she'd always seek out producers who could help her regain, the fame and the hits that she'd had. I mean, she had massive comebacks all the way along. In the mid-'80s, when she came back with Freeway of Love and songs like that was so unlikely because it was 20 years after her first hit. So I think it was that sense that she knew she was better than her peers.
And her song Respect was hailed as a civil rights anthem. You would go along with that, would you?
Yeah, absolutely. And Respect is such a great story because it hardly ever makes lists of the greatest covers of all time because people just assume that it's Aretha's song, but that was written by Otis Redding, and it's a travesty that Aretha didn't get a co-writer's credit when she covered it, because if you go back and listen to the original from Otis, it's a good song, but it's not a great song. But Aretha took that and then, obviously switched the gender around. She added the R-E-S-P-C-T part, so that wasn't in the original, and added the sock it to me's as well. So completely changed the song. And in a way, it's about, sexual empowerment and empowering women. But it was also something that, in 1968, with the death of Martin Luther King, and which came just slightly after the song, it then became adapted as a civil rights anthem.
Right, and she sang at Martin Luther King's funeral, didn't she? But you look at the 60s there, the civil rights movement. I mean, she would have been barred from a number of venues through the 60s.
Probably, though she, growing up in Detroit, so even though she was born in Memphis in the South, where there was more segregation, in Detroit as a proudly black city, that was less the case. And also her father was a very famous minister and arguably the most famous preacher in the States in the 1940s and 50s. Though he was a dicey character too. I mean, he was friends with all the right people like Martin Luther King, but he was a philanderer, and he'd actually fathered a child with a member of his congregation who was just 12 at the time. So her father was famous, well-connected, which meant that Aretha was too, but he was a tricky character. Was it true, or is it true, because this is disputed, I don't know whether you know the answer to this, Tim, that Aretha Franklin had a child at about 12 or 13? Oh, absolutely. Yes, she did. Yeah. And she wasn't shunned by, it was good that she wasn't shunned, in part because her father's own indiscretions meant that he didn't judge his daughter. Her mother had died when she was just 9, And so I think having a sort of celebrity dad who was a bit dodgy and a deceased mother may explain why that happened. But yeah, she fell pregnant age 13 and she became a mother at 14 and had 2 kids by the age of 16, and the fathers aren't really in the story.
Okay. And greatest singer of the 20th century, do you think?
I think she's absolutely a contender for it. Rolling Stone said she was the greatest of the 20th century, and yeah, I think for me, why not? And one quick little anecdote that sums it up. Imagine being Elton John. Elton loved soul music, and Bernie Taupin did, and they were a couple of English lads in their early 20s when Aretha Franklin, who was at the peak of her fame in 1970, decided to cover Border Song. This was before Elton was famous. And Elton's version is excellent, but then Aretha did it and made it even better. And you hear her voice, and she just did things that other singers could only dream of doing.
Tim, thank you very much. Appreciate it. That is Tim Roxborogh, Weekend Collective host and long-time Aretha Franklin fan. Newstalk ZB.